Have you ever wondered why sexual sins have the power to destroy even the strongest of souls? What dark spiritual forces are unleashed when we cross these forbidden boundaries? Padre Pio, who could see into the depths of human souls during confession, revealed something terrifying. These sins have the power to corrupt not just our bodies, but our very spirits, opening doorways that may never be closed. My dear brothers and sisters, today we're going to discuss 4 specific sexual sins that Padre Pio identified as spiritual death traps. These aren't just moral failings, they are spiritual weapons that the enemy uses to destroy families, corrupt societies, and claim souls for eternal damnation. The 4th sin, which we'll reveal later, was so severe that Padre Pio said it could corrupt generations. During his years of ministry, Padre Pio encountered thousands of souls trapped in these spiritual snares. He witnessed firsthand how these particular sins had the power to break not just human relationships, but the very connection between a soul and God. And these sins, he would say, create wounds in the soul that continue to bleed long after the act is committed. Before we continue, I invite you to write in the comments, Padre Pio, protect us. Your comment will help spread this crucial warning to others who are walking dangerously close to these spiritual precipices. What you're about to learn isn't just about morality, it's about understanding the devastating spiritual warfare that's targeting your soul through sexual temptation. In an age where sexual sin is not only accepted but celebrated, Padre Pio's warnings become more urgent than ever. These 4 specific sins act like spiritual poisons, slowly corrupting not just individuals, but entire families and communities. They enter our lives subtly, often disguised as natural desires or personal choices, but their consequences are eternal. What makes these sins particularly dangerous is their ability to cloud our spiritual vision. Padre Pio observed that the more deeply someone fell into these sins, the harder it became for them to recognize their spiritual danger. Like a spiritual blindness, these sins create a false sense of normalcy while slowly destroying the soul's ability to respond to God's grace. You might be wondering why these particular sins carry such severe spiritual consequences. Today, through Padre Pio's profound insights, you'll understand not just the what, but the why. Why these sins have the power to separate souls from God's grace, and more importantly, how to find freedom if you're trapped in their grasp. As we explore these difficult truths, remember, God's mercy is always available to the truly repentant heart. But first, we must understand the grave danger these sins pose to our eternal souls. Of all the sexual sins that Padre Pio encountered in the confessional, adultery carried a unique weight of spiritual destruction. He would often say to those who confessed this sin, the infidelity of the flesh creates a tear in the soul that only divine mercy can heal. Let's understand why this sin holds such devastating power over the human spirit. Adultery isn't just the physical act of betrayal, it's a spiritual weapon that Satan uses to destroy what God himself established as sacred. When God created marriage, he designed it as a reflection of Christ's relationship with his church. Every act of adultery doesn't just break a human covenant. It mocks this divine image. Padre Pio witnessed countless souls destroyed by this sin. During confession, he could see the spiritual wounds that adultery created, wounds that went far deeper than emotional pain. He described these wounds as bleeding gates, through which demonic influences could enter not just the adulterer's life, but their entire family's spiritual well-being. Consider this sobering truth. In all his years of ministry, Padre Pio noted that adulterers often experienced the most terrifying moments at death. They see, he would say, the full impact of their betrayal, not just against their spouse, but against God himself. This is why Jesus' words about adultery were so severe. Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The spiritual consequences of adultery extend far beyond the moment of sin. Padre Pio observed that adulterers often experienced a progressive spiritual blindness. The first act of infidelity was usually accompanied by intense guilt, but with each subsequent betrayal, the conscience became increasingly numb. This spiritual numbness, he warned, was more dangerous than the sin itself, as it led souls to mistake God's patience for approval. But the destruction doesn't stop with the individual. Adultery releases spiritual forces that corrupt entire families. Children of adulterers, Padre Pio noted, often carried spiritual wounds they couldn't explain, a generational impact of their parents' sin. These wounds manifested as difficulties in trusting, loving, or maintaining their own faithful relationships. The story of King David serves as a powerful warning. His adultery with Bathsheba set in motion a series of events that brought tragedy to his entire kingdom. One moment of weakness led to lies, murder, and ultimately the death of his child. Even after his repentance and God's forgiveness, David faced the earthly consequences of his sin for the rest of his life. Yet, even in the face of such a grave sin, Padre Pio offered hope. He witnessed remarkable transformations in repentant adulterers who sought God's mercy with sincere hearts. The key, he said, was understanding the full spiritual gravity of the sin. When someone truly comprehends how adultery wounds Christ himself, he would say, their repentance becomes a powerful force for healing. For those struggling with temptation, Padre Pio prescribed specific spiritual weapons: frequent confession, daily prayer, and a deep devotion to the Blessed Mother. He knew that victory over sexual sin required more than human willpower. It demanded a complete surrender to divine grace. Remember, my dear brothers and sisters, adultery begins in the heart long before it manifests in action. That's why Padre Pio urged his spiritual children to guard their thoughts and eyes with extreme vigilance. In our next segment, we'll discuss another sexual sin that often paves the way for adultery, one that our modern world has tragically normalized. The second sexual sin that Padre Pio warned about might shock many modern Christians: fornication or sexual relations outside of marriage. This sin, Padre Pio would say, has become so common that souls no longer recognize its deadly venom. In his mystic visions, he saw how this sin created spiritual wounds that could take generations to heal. What makes fornication particularly dangerous in our times is its widespread acceptance. Even within Christian communities, many have begun to view it as a minor transgression, if they consider it a sin at all. But Padre Pio's insights reveal a terrifying spiritual reality behind this seemingly normal behavior. During confession, he could see how each act of fornication left invisible scars on the soul, scars that made it increasingly difficult for a person to form a genuine, holy marriage in the future. The spiritual damage of fornication goes far deeper than most realize. Padre Pio observed that this sin created a type of spiritual bondage, an invisible chain that linked souls together in ways that persisted long after the physical relationship ended. Each person you unite with outside of marriage, he warned, takes a piece of your soul, and you take a piece of theirs. These spiritual fragments can torment souls for years, even after conversion. Modern psychology has only recently begun to understand what Padre Pio saw clearly through spiritual eyes: the deep emotional and psychological wounds caused by casual sexual relationships. But he saw something even more alarming: how fornication opened doorways for demonic influence in a person's life. These influences often manifested as increasingly intense sexual temptations, relationship difficulties, and a progressive hardening of the heart toward God. Padre Pio would often share the story of a young woman who came to him for confession. She had lived a sexually active lifestyle before marriage and couldn't understand why her marriage was now falling apart. Through his spiritual gifts, Padre Pio revealed to her how her past sexual sins had created spiritual barriers that were now preventing her from fully bonding with her husband. The body may forget, he explained, but the soul remembers every transgression against its purity. The saint's teachings on fornication were particularly urgent because he saw how this sin often led to more severe sexual transgressions. It acted as a gateway, gradually desensitizing the soul to sexual sin, while creating an increasingly insatiable appetite for pleasure. This spiritual hunger, he noted, could never be satisfied through physical means, leading many souls into darker and more destructive behaviors. Yet, even for this sin, Padre Pio offered hope. He witnessed countless souls find complete healing and restoration through sincere repentance and the sacraments. The key, he emphasized, was understanding fornication not just as a physical act, but as a spiritual violation. When you comprehend how this sin wounds the Sacred Heart of Jesus, he would say, true repentance becomes possible. For those struggling with this sin, Padre Pio prescribed specific spiritual remedies, regular confession, daily prayer, fasting, and a special devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. He understood that overcoming sexual temptation required both divine grace and human effort. Don't fight this battle on your knees, he would advise, because the enemy of purity can only be defeated through prayer. As we conclude this discussion on fornication, remember that God's mercy is always available to the truly repentant heart. But we must also heed Padre Pio's urgent warning. The normalization of this sin in our society doesn't diminish its spiritual consequences. Each act of fornication is a serious wound to the soul, a betrayal of God's plan for human sexuality, and a step away from eternal salvation. My dear brothers and sisters, I can sense in my heart that these revelations from Padre Pio about sexual sins have deeply touched your soul. Many of you are probably wondering, how can I protect myself and my loved ones from these spiritual dangers? What prayers and practices did Padre Pio recommend for those struggling with these temptations? It's precisely for this reason that we've prepared something special for you. Los Secretos Espirituales de San Padre Pio, a powerful spiritual guide that contains the saint's most profound teachings on overcoming sexual temptation and finding true spiritual freedom. This sacred material includes Padre Pio's powerful prayers for protection against sexual sins, his specific spiritual practices for maintaining purity, and deep insights into winning the battle for your soul. You'll discover the exact prayers he recommended to his spiritual children who were fighting these same battles you're facing today. Click the link in the comments section now to access this transformative guide. Remember, Padre Pio said that spiritual warfare requires spiritual weapons, and in this guide, you'll find his most powerful tools for achieving victory over sexual temptation. And now, let us continue with Padre Pio's urgent warnings about the third sexual sin, one that he said has the power to corrupt not just individuals, but entire societies. The third sexual sin that Padre Pio identified as particularly devastating combines two interconnected spiritual poisons, prostitution and uncontrolled lust. And these sins, he would say during spiritual direction, create a darkness in the soul so deep that it can take multiple generations to cleanse. Through his mystical gifts, he could see how these sins created a type of spiritual radiation that contaminated not just the individual, but entire families and communities. What made prostitution especially alarming to Padre Pio was its dual nature of destruction. It corrupts both the provider and the consumer of these services. During confession, he would witness how this sin created a unique type of spiritual wound, different from other sexual sins. It's not just the act itself, he would explain, but the commercialization of God's sacred gift that creates such deep spiritual damage. The spiritual consequences he observed were severe. Those involved in prostitution, whether providing or partaking, developed what Padre Pio called spiritual leprosy, a progressive deadening of the soul's ability to perceive God's presence. He could see dark spiritual entities attached to those involved in these practices, entities that would then follow them home and influence their families. But it wasn't just prostitution itself that concerned the saint. He saw how uncontrolled lust, even without physical acts, could create similar spiritual devastation. Lust, Padre Pio would warn, is like a spiritual acid that dissolves the soul's protective barriers. Through his supernatural insight, he witnessed how persistent lustful thoughts created actual channels in the spiritual realm through which demonic influences could enter a person's life. The saint observed a terrifying pattern. Those who gave themselves over to lust eventually lost the ability to experience genuine love. He would describe how the spiritual faculty for love became corrupted, leaving these souls unable to form deep, meaningful relationships. They become like spiritual vampires, he would say, always hungry but never satisfied, consuming others without receiving true nourishment. Padre Pio spoke of a particular case that deeply moved him, a wealthy businessman who regularly engaged with prostitutes. This man came to confession believing his sin was minor, since he was paying for the services. Through his spiritual gifts, Padre Pio revealed to him the vast network of spiritual destruction his actions had created, how each encounter had formed dark spiritual bonds that were affecting not just him, but his children and even his grandchildren. The combination of prostitution and lust, Padre Pio warned, created a particularly dangerous spiritual trap. The more a person engaged in these sins, the more their spiritual vision became distorted, making it increasingly difficult to recognize the severity of their condition. This spiritual blindness often led to a form of addiction that required both divine intervention and intense spiritual warfare to overcome. However, even for these deeply rooted sins, Padre Pio offered hope. He prescribed specific spiritual remedies, intense prayer, regular fasting, and most importantly, a complete break from all occasions of sin. The healing process, he would explain, requires spiritual quarantine, a period of complete separation from anything that might trigger lustful thoughts or desires. For those battling these sins, Padre Pio recommended a particular devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, whom he saw as a powerful ally in the fight for purity. He would often say, "Where Mary's purity is honored, Satan's lust cannot take root." This devotion, combined with regular confession and the Eucharist, formed the foundation of his prescription for spiritual healing. We now arrive at what Padre Pio identified as the most severe category of sexual sins, transgressions so grave that he said they cry out to heaven for vengeance. These sins, involving the corruption of family bonds and the violation of natural law, carried consequences so severe that the saint often witnessed their spiritual effects extending across multiple generations. During his years of ministry, Padre Pio encountered souls who had fallen into these gravest of sins. What he saw through his mystical gifts deeply disturbed him. These sins, he would say, create a type of spiritual nuclear waste that contaminates not just the soul, but the very spiritual territory of a family line. He could see how these transgressions created what he called spiritual mutations, distortions in the soul that could take generations to heal. The corruption of family bonds through incestuous acts particularly grieved Padre Pio. Through his supernatural insight, he witnessed how these sins created spiritual fractures that ran deeper than any other sexual transgression. And when sacred family bonds are perverted, he would explain, it creates a type of spiritual cancer that spreads through the entire family tree. He could see how these sins opened doorways for generational curses and demonic strongholds that would affect families for decades. The violations against natural law, which Padre Pio ranked among the most severe sexual sins, represented what he called a complete rebellion against God's created order. Through his spiritual gifts, he could see how these acts created a unique type of spiritual damage, one that altered the very essence of a person's humanity. But these sins, he would warn us, don't just wound the soul. They begin to erase the divine image in which we were created. The saint observed that these severe sexual sins carried a particularly dangerous spiritual consequence. They could permanently damage a soul's ability to perceive God's presence. He described witnessing souls who had repeatedly engaged in these acts, developing what he called spiritual gangrene, a progressive death of their spiritual sensibilities that made conversion increasingly difficult with each transgression. However, even in these darkest cases, Padre Pio maintained that God's mercy could reach the truly repentant soul. He would share the story of a person who came to him in confession, totally enslaved by these severe sins. Through intense spiritual warfare, combined with sincere repentance and the sacraments, this soul experienced complete liberation. No sin is beyond God's mercy, he would say, but these sins require an extraordinary measure of grace and a complete commitment to spiritual rehabilitation. For those affected by these severe sexual sins, whether directly or through family history, Padre Pio prescribed specific spiritual remedies. He recommended extended periods of fasting, regular exercised water, specific prayers of deliverance, and most importantly, a complete immersion in the sacramental life of the Church. Evangels, the healing from these sins, he would explain, requires nothing less than a total spiritual transformation. The saint emphasized the importance of breaking generational patterns through intentional spiritual warfare. He would often say, these sins must be fought not just in the present, but also in their historical roots. He recommended specific prayers of renunciation and healing masses offered for family lineages affected by these severe transgressions. Padre Pio's final warning about these sins was perhaps his most sobering. Those who die unrepentant of these grave transgressions face the most terrifying spiritual consequences. Yet, he always balanced this warning with hope, reminding us that genuine repentance, combined with the blood of Christ, could cleanse even the deepest spiritual corruption. My dear brothers and sisters, we've journeyed through Padre Pio's profound revelations about the 4 sexual sins that pose the greatest danger to our souls. These aren't just moral guidelines. They are urgent spiritual warnings from a saint who could see the devastating spiritual consequences of sexual sin with his own mystic eyes. Remember how Padre Pio described these sins: adultery, which destroys the sacred covenant of marriage; fornication, which corrupts God's gift of sexuality; prostitution and lust, which enslave the soul; and finally, those gravest sins that distort the very image of God within us. Each of these creates not just physical or emotional consequences, but deep spiritual wounds that can affect generations. But there is hope. Padre Pio's message wasn't just one of warning, it was also one of profound hope in God's mercy. No matter how deep someone has fallen into sexual sin, the blood of Christ has the power to cleanse and restore. The saint witnessed countless souls find complete liberation through sincere repentance and the sacraments. If these teachings have touched your heart, I invite you to take 2 important actions right now. First, write "I choose purity" in the comments below. This declaration becomes a spiritual milestone in your journey. Second, share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Your share might be the divine appointment that saves a soul from spiritual destruction. For those seeking deeper spiritual guidance, remember that our ebook, Los Secretos Espirituales de San Padre Pio, is available through the link in the comments. Let Padre Pio's wisdom guide you to complete spiritual freedom. Until we meet again in our next video, may the Virgin Mary protect your purity, and may Padre Pio intercede for your spiritual victory.